When I was 20, I began attending a new church in my college town, and after every service, I had a choice to make. Would I accept the lunch invitation from some sweet retired couple, or the lunch invitation from a young family? Every Sunday I went, it seems that somebody different would approach me and ask me if I had plans for lunch yet. But it wasn't usually a matter of choosing between 2 offers, but up to 5 offers. And it didn't matter that I'd hardly met these people. They would welcome me into their home to share a meal and conversation. I have so many fond memories of lazy Sunday afternoons with my hands gripped around a warm bowl of soup with the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen, all in modest homes, and the welcome that I experienced there. Now fast forward 5 years and I'm new here to St. Louis to attend seminary, and I'm searching for a new church to call home. So my roommate tells me he's going to go check out a church nearby, and so I go with him. After the service, we stand up and he goes to talk to somebody that he recognizes, and I just kind of stand there and wait. And I look around and I see a lot of well-dressed people talking and laughing and catching up with each other or running for the door to grab kids. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited. About 5 minutes later, after observing these people, all my brothers and sisters in Christ, my roommate noticed something. None of them had noticed me standing there. I don't know what my face looked like after 5 minutes of just waiting to be seen or welcomed or approached. But when my roommate noticed it, he later on recreated it like he was David Attenborough narrating a nature documentary. He said this, "And there was a lone Keith, like a castaway, clinging to a single piece of driftwood. As he watches from the sea, the fun ship cruises keep sailing by." Let's just say my experience at Memorial was much better than my time there. But I've learned over the years that my experience here and in my college church are not the norm. American singer John Charles Thomas, at the age of 66, wrote this to a syndicated columnist. "I am presently completing the 2nd year of a 3-year survey on the hospitality or lack of it in churches. To date, of the 195 churches I have visited, I was spoken to in only one by someone other than an official greeter, and that was to ask me to move my feet." What happened, or didn't happen, in those 195 churches, and the fact that today there are multiple blogs, books, and articles written by Christians with titles like "The Lost Art of Hospitality," tells us we may have forgotten why Christianity for centuries has been associated with it, and in ways beyond what happens in a Sunday morning. And so this morning, as we finish our sermon series on living in line with the gospel, we're going to look at the ancient Christian practice of hospitality with the hope that it would not be a lost art among us. We're beginning with the New Testament letter to the Hebrews, chapter 13, beginning at verse 1 through 5, and then 11 through 14. You can see it on the screen. This is God's word. "Keep on loving each other as brothers. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing, some people have entertained angels without knowing it," a reference to Abraham in Genesis 18. "Remember those in prison, as if you were their fellow prisoners, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. Marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, 'Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you.' The high priest carries the blood of animals into the most holy place as a sin offering, but the bodies are burned outside the camp. And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace that he bore. For here we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city to come." If this ancient Christian practice of hospitality is going to be a modern reality for us, then we need to consider 3 things this morning: the nature of hospitality, the importance of hospitality, and the source of hospitality. While another person might investigate if I'm hearing a little bit of a ringing or a feedback, if something can be adjusted for that. That would be great. Anyway, off to the first thing. What is the nature of Christian hospitality? Now that's a harder question than you might think, because if you look in verse 2 and you see this word entertain, it can be easy to insert our modern notions of entertaining guests, and maybe picturing like Martha Stewart or one of her books about how do I create a perfect, beautiful, well-decorated environment with just the right flowers in the right vase in the right place, or serving some amazing mouth-watering dish. But that's not what this is talking about. Entertaining in this modern sense implies a performance, maybe a show you put on, and is often more about the host and their appearance than the guest. And that's not biblical hospitality. So what is it about? Well, it is not having a big, well-decorated, or even a clean house. And it's not about being a good cook either. Let me tell you, all these things are nice, but they are not what it's about. You see, in fact, assuming that any of those things are necessary for hospitality will probably stop you from offering it. For example, when I was in 6th grade, I spent a lot of time on this street out in front of a friend's home, but never inside the home. You see, every time he came out to say hi, he told me that his mom said the house was not clean enough for anybody to come over, and then he would go back inside. We were never really that close. Hospitality is not about having the perfect home. Neither is it about having impressive hosting skills or even being outgoing. I used to work with wedding DJs who are easily the most outgoing people you will ever meet. People who would welcome hundreds of people every week into some different venue to entertain them. But I also learned there's a difference between being eager to stand up and speak with people than to be eager to sit down and listen to them. So what is hospitality about? Well, we see it in verse 1. Keep on loving each other as brothers. Hospitality is first and foremost an expression of love, a command elaborated on in verse 2 with the call to entertain strangers, or as others translate it, show hospitality to strangers. But in the Greek that it's written in, that phrase is just one word, philoxenia, a combination of a Greek word for love, philo, like Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, and xeno, the word for stranger. Philoxenia is the opposite of another word you might be more familiar with, xenophobia, the fear of strangers. Biblical hospitality, this philoxenia, is literally, as the lexicons say, love for strangers or foreigners, and can be translated as hospitality or kindness to strangers, where a stranger is anyone not regarded as a member of the extended family or a close friend. Hospitality is not theoretical. This is practical. As New Testament scholar William Lane notes, hospitality is an expression of love for Jesus, which meets the needs of his brothers and sisters, a definition that fits right in with verse 1 about keep on loving each other as brothers. Yeah. In the context of Hebrews 13, brothers implies this is about our family obligation to fellow believers. It's what we see in Romans 12, verse 13, when Paul writes, share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Hospitality is part of how God's people were meant to relate to each other. Now, I've heard that back in the 1970s, what kept this congregation going was not the preaching. It was not the worship. It was that people were constantly in each other's homes, giving and receiving hospitality. But Christian hospitality is not just for God's people, but actually anyone who's in need. In the scripture reading, we heard from Luke 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus tells this story of a man traveling when he is robbed and stripped and beaten and left half dead on the side of the road in response to somebody asking, well, who is my neighbor? So he tells about three people, a priest and a teacher of the law who would have been perceived as the holy men of their day. Each passed by on the other side of the road. But, Jesus says, a Samaritan, who Jews considered to be ethnically and spiritually compromised people, as he traveled by, when he saw him, it says he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn to take care of him. And then the next day gave the innkeeper 2 silver coins, like giving him $200, and said, look after him, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expenses. You see, the Samaritan found somebody who could not walk, and so he put him on his own donkey. He couldn't welcome him into his own home because they were traveling, and so he took the wounded man to an inn where he could be safely fed and sheltered, rest and recovered like it was his own home, and ensured that despite the fact this man had been robbed, all of his bills would be paid. He showed this man mercy, but mostly it came in the form of acts of hospitality. Jesus then concludes by saying, "Go and do likewise." What did Jesus use to illustrate love for one's neighbor? In a word, hospitality that crosses boundaries and meets the needs of others. It is not just for fellow believers, and its connection to people in need is not just in this parable. In Romans 12 and in our own passage, hospitality is mentioned right next to the calls for caring for those in need, because hospitality and acts of mercy often overlap. Practically speaking, hospitality is helping or welcoming others, especially strangers and those in need. So what's it look like for us today? Well, first of all, it's opening up homes to anyone, like neighbors, coworkers, classmates, and this does not have to be extravagant. For example, are you planning on watching something later on today? Well, you can invite somebody over to watch with you. Do you wind down with a drink after a day of work? Invite some over to join you. You got homework to do? Invite a classmate to have a study date with you or something. Do you have friends who just can't really get out much because they've got small kids and bedtimes and bath times? Well, you can bring something to their place after the kids are in bed and share it with them. Shh, kids, we actually go to bed right after you go to bed. Don't listen to any of this. You don't have to overthink this. As author Max Lucado put it, do you have a front door, a table, chairs, maybe some meat and bread? Congratulations, you have just qualified to participate in the most ancient ministry of hospitality. This does not have to be a big deal. This can be spontaneous. Canadian author Karen Stiller, the editor of Faith Today magazine, writes, "Hospitality is not about impressing others. It's about making space for them." If you're already hosting Thanksgiving this week, it could look like leaving extra seats at the table for those away from family, something that someone I talked to before the service says is exactly where they're going to be going for Thanksgiving, which is awesome. One family I know decided that they would open up their home on Sunday nights for anybody who wants to come in, hang out, have some snacks or a drink, play a game, or do whatever, and they did so for years, and even do so on days that are not Sunday, when countless people have come over the years and been granted refrigerator rights, which means you don't have to ask permission just to go to the refrigerator and get something out of it, because they realize that's why we put extra stuff in there. And yet hospitality also looks like helping weary travelers along their way. I can't tell you as a family of one how many times people have opened up their home when I was traveling cross country and needed a bed or a couch for the night, something that's a little more complicated when now you're a family of four. But not to mention the number of friends who years ago brought me into their homes for a season when I was between calls as a pastor. And for all of you, I thank you dearly. And yet hospitality is not just about how we use our home. A number of you have prepared and delivered more meals than you can count for someone who is recovering from childbirth or surgery or grieving the loss of a loved one. This winter, many of you are going to welcome in from the cold the ladies who are staying at the Grace and Peace Women's Shelter so that they can actually experience a warm meal because you've prepared it, delivered it, and even share that meal with them there. This month, as a church, we're collecting food for the Good Grounds Food Pantry so that others, total strangers to you, will be able to eat something in their own home, because hospitality is love for strangers. And yet, as Christians, we also have a spiritual home to welcome people into. Every week, we have right here a public worship service that anybody can come to regardless of their beliefs or lack thereof. And yet the majority of those who say they have stopped attending church anywhere actually say they still hold basic Christian's belief and say that they would return to church if only someone like a good friend would invite them. Most of you are in community groups where people are welcomed into a home, something that might feel more comfortable for some than coming to a Sunday worship service. places where the welcome of Jesus that we long for people to experience is lived out in everyday life. And in many ways, these community groups are just as much an expression of your spiritual home as a Sunday worship service. Some of you help with the welcome team, greeting or connecting people. Others, actually, you show hospitality by doing things behind the scenes. Every Sunday morning, someone you may not see helps make that warm cup of coffee that welcomes you when you come in. Every day, we've got a few people in the balcony who don't simply hand out words on a page that you can look down at while you're singing, but run projections so that you can look up and see the words that you're singing, and we can all hear each other's voices that way, as well as people that go up there to run the live stream as a way of welcoming into our spiritual home those who physically cannot be here with us. All of these, the balcony jobs, are what one person described as an introvert's dream. And yet they help offer the welcome of Jesus to many. In our spiritual home, we also welcome those who are in need. Every Sunday we have deacons on duty to meet with those in our community with material or financial need, or to hear their situation, to pray with them, to offer whatever help seems best. And when you give to the Mercy Fund, that's what helps meet those needs. And so that the welcome that we have received and we live out together can actually be unleashed in practical ways for the benefit of others who don't even go here. And yet someone doesn't need to come to our building to receive that type of welcome. Hospitality can look like welcoming people into our city, particularly immigrants and refugees, by donating furniture, dishes, or even groceries through groups like Oasis or the International Institute, or helping people new to this country learn to speak English, which I know a couple of you are doing each week, all of which tells total strangers, even people you've never met, that they are welcome in our city. Hospitality helps weary travelers along the way, whether they're traveling far on a physical journey or are looking for a place of rest on their spiritual journey. Hospitality is about welcoming people, making them feel welcome, sharing with others, caring for their needs, and doing so willingly. In 1 Peter 4, verse 9, the apostle urges Jesus' followers to be hospitable with one another, helping weary travelers along their way, showing kindness to strangers, but to do so, Peter writes, without showing complaint. And you don't mention complaining about something unless there's a cost involved. Time, resources, the awkwardness of initiating towards people, the fear of opening not just one's home, but one's life to other people, the mental work it takes to be intentional about these things. And all of these things will hinder our own expressions of hospitality if we don't also grasp the importance of hospitality. There's a reason that in a chapter on showing love, hospitality is the first thing that's mentioned. You see, it was incredibly important in the ancient world because back then, travel could be dangerous. You didn't go from here to there in a metal contraption with doors that lock. You're exposed. You could be robbed, just like Jesus illustrated in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Also, there were not many inns, and poor Christians couldn't afford to stay there anyway. And so travelers would often go to a certain place, either the well or the city gate, and wait until someone offered to bring them out of the darkness and into the safety of their home. But there was also a screening process where before you would be brought in, travelers might bring letters of commendation or something from a well-known figure that could vouch for them. All of this was part of what you might call the hospitality code of their day. Things like you could stay a night, maybe two, but then you needed to move on. Because as important as hospitality was, it was a matter of expedience. It was really a bad look if everybody that came through your town gets robbed like every night. Hospitality was incredibly important in the ancient world, but even more so for Christians. Two different places in the Bible tell us that hospitality is a requirement for a Christian leader. Back then, there were no church buildings like we're in now, and so hospitality would have included opening up someone's home for corporate worship. You see, from the beginning, hospitality was a central element of the gathered worship of God's people. And for the early Christians, it was necessary for mission. As Jesus and his disciples went from town to town, they were entirely dependent on the hospitality of others in order to do their ministry. We see it in the Gospels as Jesus sends out his 12 to minister or the 70 or the 72. We see it as one of the factors in Acts 2 when the Lord added to their number daily those who are being saved, meaning new disciples, the one product that the church is called to make. And it was vital as believers would travel with collections that they were taking up for Christians in poverty to other cities, back in a time when people were often disowned by their families when they began to follow Jesus. Hospitality was necessary for ministry and the mission of God back then, and it's also necessary for the same today. You see, most people who first come to a church come because they've been brought by someone else. I'll tell you a secret. Most churches don't meet in historic English Gothic cathedrals on major roads across from the largest urban park in the country. And yet a pretty building in a good location only does so much, especially today. You see, a church can be a scary place to go for those with negative experiences in church or with anxiety disorders. A number of single women that I've talked with over the years talk about how awkward they feel when they come to church alone. People need to be invited, to be offered rides, to be told that they are welcome and they don't have to sit alone if they do not want to. Hospitality may be even more important in our modern time when so many people reject Christianity because they perceive it to be xenophobic. Xenophobia, the fear or hatred of strangers and foreigners, is the literal opposite of Christian hospitality. It's a view often rooted in the belief that someone's own culture or nation is superior to and that outsiders threaten the existing community. It expresses distrust or disgust towards perceived outsiders and their culture. Xenophobia avoids interactions with people that they see as foreigners, blaming outsiders for local problems like economic issues, portraying outsiders as inherently threatening or dangerous, which can fuel hostility and even extreme actions. It was behind South Africa's apartheid system, Jewish persecution and the Holocaust and long before, and Jim Crow laws in our own country, and more recently, the scapegoating of foreign nationals during COVID. Every one of these things undermines the Christian mission of making disciples of all nations, offering the welcome of Jesus to all. And yet Jesus' followers are called to something radically different. You see, in Leviticus 19, the same place we find the command to love your neighbor as yourself, we read this. When an alien, meaning a foreigner, lives with you in your land, do not mistreat him. The alien living with you must be treated as one of your native born. Love him as yourself, for you were aliens in Egypt. Some of you have heard that within a 3-mile radius of our building, there are more people born overseas than there are teenagers, most of them international students. And yet most international students will spend years here studying and never get invited into an American home. And yet the impact of simply opening up someone's home cannot be overestimated. Jim Peterson tells the story of Mario, a friend from South America, with whom he had studied the Bible for 4 years before Mario himself became a Christian. Now, the Bible studies reflected the fact that Mario was a Marxist intellectual who had read all of the leading Western philosophers. A couple of years after his conversion, Mario and Jim were reminiscing. Do you remember what it really was that made me decide to become a Christian? Mario asked. Peterson thought of all their Bible studies and philosophical discussions. Mario's reply took him by surprise. Remember that first time I stopped by your house? We were on our way someplace together, and I had a bowl of soup with you and your family. As I sat there observing you, your wife, and your children, and how you relate to each other, I asked myself, when will I have a relationship like this with my fiancée? When I realized the answer was never, I concluded that I needed to become a Christian for the sake of my own survival. Peterson did remember that occasion. He remembered his children behaving so badly and his frustration at having to keep on correcting them in front of Mario. And yet Mario saw the grace of Christ binding this family together. Years later, Peterson would comment on that incident. We tend to see the weaknesses and incongruities in our lives, and our reaction is to recoil at the thought of letting outsiders get close enough to see us as we really are. Even if our assessment is accurate, It is my observation that any Christian who sincerely is seeking to walk with God, in spite of all of their flaws, is reflecting something of Christ. And there are few things that reflect Christ more than Christian hospitality. It was almost 20 years ago that members of this church founded the Chapel Sanctuary for the Arts, just 200 feet that direction, as a ministry of hospitality to the arts community, providing free performance or gallery space for artists, musicians, theater groups, and performers, where 100% of the ticket sales go to the artists themselves, and every guest receives 2 free drink tickets. All of this in order to offer the welcome of Jesus to those who mostly don't believe the same things that we do. After one of the shows where most of the actors were LGBTQ people, one of them started asking our night's bartender, one of our pastors, "We know what you all believe here, but we don't understand. Why are you treating us so well?" He replied, "It's because of what we believe that we want to treat you well." And so she began talking, sharing her story for about a half an hour. At the end of it, she said, "Thank you. This is the first time that a Christian has listened to me." Friends, a lot of bridges have been burned between professing Christians and members of the arts and the LGBT communities. But that night, a single act of hospitality began rebuilding them. Hospitality shares its space and lends a listening ear. And it's part of what has always made Christians a peculiar people, and yet that invites curiosity. It baffled people in the ancient world. In the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Julian led a campaign to revive paganism in the recently Christianized Roman Empire. And in a letter to a priest, he writes this. This is up to a pagan priest. "For it is disgraceful that when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans," that's what he called Christians, "support not only their own poor, but ours as well, while all men see that our people lack aid from us." Christian hospitality, extending beyond fellow believers to anybody in need, was so baffling, yet so powerful, that Julian instructed his pagan priests to try to minister more like the Christians did. And yet, centuries before this, Christians baffled the Roman Empire by their care for unwanted children. Back then, an unwanted child, often baby girls, could be legally abandoned on trash heaps to either die of exposure or to be taken as slaves by others. But Christians would then often take these children in, saving them from certain death or slavery, and providing lifelong hospitality by raising them as their own children. Christians were a peculiar people. And even though much of what made them stand out centuries ago has been largely adopted by modern Western culture, the unique combination of things in the Christian ethic still stands out today. For example, in verse 3, we can read, "Remember those who are in prison." Meaning, don't just keep them in your thoughts, but in a time when prisons generally didn't provide you food, this meant family and friends and church members would go and make sure that they don't die of starvation. When it goes on to mention those who are mistreated, a word meaning the oppressed, those who suffer injustice, it shows a concern for social justice, something Christians were known for from the beginning. Now, if you take the concern for the incarcerated, for social justice, the concern for the poor we see throughout Scripture, and then you add the warning in verse 5 against the love of money, a warning against greed, and you package that together, a modern American would hear just that and say, Christianity sounds pretty liberal. And yet right in the middle of those verses, in verse 4, we read another warning, that God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral, where that last phrase is broader than adultery and refers to anyone having sex outside of the marriage of a husband and a wife. You tell someone just that verse, and they'll say, Christianity sounds really conservative. And yet Christianity is neither about being what modern people call either of those things, and yet all of this flows from one single ethic, that you are not your own. Your body is not your own. Your resources are not your own. Your space is not your own. They are gifts of God that you've given to you to be stewarded according to God's purposes. And the fact that all of this comes in one letter, in back-to-back verses, means we cannot separate these ethics and still call it Christianity. If our version of Christianity only includes what resonates with the modern cultural or even political ideology, it will lose what makes it so unique and powerful in all times. In fact, recent history shows that those who largely rallied around the seemingly liberal elements of Christianity have seen their churches shrink rapidly over the past half-century. And there is no shortage of stories today about those fleeing churches that have rallied around the elements considered conservative to the exclusion of the elements that are not. Neither ethic reflects Christianity of both the scriptures and history. And if we abandon it for something that better fits any modern category, Christianity loses not only its missional edge, but perhaps its very soul. An ethic of love that in this passage literally begins with hospitality. And yet the biggest reason for hospitality's importance is that it's actually a sign of our own faith. In Matthew 25, Jesus pictures this final judgment like a shepherd king separating sheep from goats. Those that he calls his sheep, the righteous, he welcomes into his kingdom, saying, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world." But the reasoning he gives for that pronouncement is almost all in terms of hospitality. He says, "For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in." And when they ask, "When did we do all these things?" he says, "Whatever you did for the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." And yet to those who do the opposite, Jesus says, "They will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life." You see, in a very real sense, hospitality is an indication of whether we really know what it means to be Jesus' followers. He says you can't call yourself one of my followers without it. I mean, it's a challenging passage. As Christine Pohl writes, hospitality is central to the meaning of the gospel and a practice by which we can welcome Jesus. But this does not come naturally. It can even be kind of scary. So where do you get the power to actually live this way? What's the source of Christian hospitality? In a word, remembering. In Ephesians 2:12 and 13, we read, "Remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world." You see, before these people became followers of Jesus, they, like the rest of us, were, spiritually speaking, strangers and aliens, separated from a holy God because of sin. In a sense, we were outsiders, in the dark, needing to be brought in. Verse 13, "But now," Paul writes, "in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ." He goes on in verse 19, "So then, you are no longer strangers and aliens, but are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God." If you're a Christian here this morning, here's your story. You were the stranger, the alien, the outsider. And because of your sin, because of your desire to run your own life and all the things that flow from that, you could never pass the screening process at the gates to be brought in to God's home. Not a God whose standard is "be holy because I am holy." You weren't worthy to be brought in from that city gate. So someone else had to go out. Towards the end of our Hebrews passage in verse 12, we read, "So Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood." You see, Jesus called the temple in Jerusalem my Father's house. That's where he belonged, not just in the city gates, but the temple itself. And yet, when Jesus was rejected, they crucified him outside the city gate, away from where he should have been welcomed, so that we instead could be welcomed into his Father's house, into God's presence. Not a building that was later destroyed, but the one that Jesus mentions in John 14. "In my Father's house there are many rooms. I go there to prepare a place for you." But before he could go, Jesus had to die as a substitute for his people, paying the just penalty for his people's sins with his own blood, that he might make us holy. You see, Jesus went out that city gate to 2,000 years ago so that we might come in and receive the Father's hospitality, his love for strangers, even sinners. Jesus died on the cross to make room in the house of God. And when you remember that that's your story, or when you become a Christian and that becomes your story, that you are the recipient of God's radical hospitality, it is only natural that you would then want to offer the same to others. It's why we can read in Hebrews 13, verse 13, "Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace that he bore," a reference to the price that Jesus paid so that we could be welcomed in, that we in turn might be willing to pay the price of welcoming others in. And it's all with a certain end in mind. Verse 14, "For here we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that is to come, the city described in Revelation 21 and 22, the city of God, where," we read, "the dwelling place of God is now with humanity, with his people," a recreation of Eden. Hospitality is therefore actually a pilgrim virtue, because we are on a pilgrimage to the city of God. That is your ultimate home if your faith is in Jesus Christ, fully secured for you by Christ's blood, so that God can say to us what we see in verse 5, "Never will I leave you, never ever will I forsake you." And it's when we have that confidence, that security, that the one who showed us such radical hospitality, that we now can go to him outside the camp and pay the price of hospitality ourselves, because we've been captivated by someone who paid a far greater price so that we could be welcomed into his home as our eternal home, even today.